Welcome everyone to Rebel Impact for another video where we talk tactically about Star Wars Destiny. I'm your host, Rebel Gray, and today we're going to talk about how FFG is striking a literal balance both within their game and outside of it amongst the players themselves. Specifically, we're going to discuss their responses to the changing meta from both a proactive and a reactive standpoint. And throughout the presentation, I'm going to be offering some reasons and justifications for why certain balance changes happen. I could be right or wrong, but either way, I'm going to put something in your mind for consideration so you can perhaps see where they are coming from. So not too long ago, Rules Reference Guide version 1.5 came along and hit us with a brand new section called Balance of the Force. I did a video on it, as did many others, regarding the point changes and why we felt that they were needed. And there was a lot of discussion around whether or not those changes were good for the game or they weren't. Some content creators even provided opinions on what cards could see some change down the road. In fact, there are even murmurings about that right now in regards to legacies. And I'm sure if you've been to your local store lately or a big tournament, you have probably heard some of that. And there have also been card erratas over time that have done some rebalancing as well. And that's going to come up quite a lot today as well as we go through this. So essentially what I'd like to cover here are the many considerations that go into balancing the game, from justifying point changes to creating cards that are different than what we've already seen, or just taking an existing idea and reapplying it in some way. And I'd also like to take a look at the Holocron documents briefly and give those a minute in the sun. And I think too that there's going to be some speculation happening here. Now, I'm not usually one for speculation, but I do like to talk about theory, and a lot of this video is going to be focusing on general theory, right? Because I don't work for FFG. I don't know any of this is fact, but this is stuff that you can extrapolate quite a bit. So this video is basically going to be doing a bit of that theory crafting so that we can get settled into this new set with some brand new cards and some fresh talking points and things like that. So for some of you, you might find this topic really informative, and still others are going to likely skip it. But that's all right. I'm just going to make the video, and I'm going to let it speak for itself. Here's your chance to grab a pen if you want to take notes. I'll be right back. Star Wars Destiny just had its birthday, and after a year of the game being out there, it sure has aged quite a bit. It's seen its version of the Terrible 2s with SOR, and it's moving into its fourth, maybe even fifth set, depending on how you're counting. And for most people, probably think it's moving along quite nicely. But not everyone is as optimistic as all that, because some of it has admittedly been a pretty rocky road to get where we are today. And FFG has recognized some of those bumps, and it has corrected the course of the game the best way they know how, and that's with balance changes. And if you've ever played a game, StarCraft, an MMO, whatever, you know that there are balance changes. Even Magic the Gathering has bumps in the road and balance changes. But specifically, there was one balance change that probably had the greatest impact on the game to date and will moving forward. And no, I'm not talking about the hyperspace jump errata, although that was significant. I'm talking about the addition of the Balance of the Force section, which is now also included in the Holocron standard document. And the idea behind this change is to allow designers to increase or decrease the points of characters as they see fit for the most popular format in the game going forward, which is standard constructed. And I suspect that a year from now, we're going to see a Holocron document for the infinite format surface, and this section of the rules may be carried over into that one. Or maybe not, depending on how Wild West FFG wants that format to be or will allow it to be. And the question that they must answer for each card that they don't carry over to that document is pretty simple but difficult to word. And it's this: how game-breaking will it be to put this character's points back to what is printed on the card within this format, which is moving ever forward in card availability and power creep? And I'm not sure that that is an easy question to answer for those who don't know what the card pool is. So you and I can't answer that question. But FFG knows what the card pool is, right? And so that gives them an advantage to be able to make that decision when the time comes about 12 months from now. And I want to take a moment to test this theory in our minds right now, okay? Ask yourself this. In the current Legacies meta, if Awakening's Poe Dameron was not part of the balance of the Force and his point cost was still 1418 as it is here on the screen, would he be as meta warping now as he was 6 months ago? My personal answer is no, although I've rebuilt the deck and tweaked it. I'm going to be testing it next Wednesday. But we got to ask ourselves too, if he would still be a consideration within the meta. And I think that the answer to that would be yes, to a degree, because 4-wide decks would still be at risk of losing basically in round 1, early round 2. Ask yourself this same exact question, whether or not putting the points value back on the card to what it was would, affect Phasma in such a way that suddenly she would start running the table in this format again. And what you're going to realize when you're having these thoughts is that the driving force for these balance changes have both short-term and long-term advantages. And I want to break those down in the next couple of sections. So let's begin with short-term advantages of the balance of the force changes. Right away, what comes to mind is perception. Perception is a very strong tool that designers and publishers can use to persuade gamers that they are paying attention to their game and the meta. And that's not to say that, that they're only trying to convey that for some kind of image purposes. No, not at all. It's not what I'm saying. It's just a really good side effect, if nothing else. Another element felt immediately after a balance of the force change is that the meta shift occurs literally overnight as a card like Captain Phasma here loses several major pairings. In fact, her change in the balance of the force pretty much sealed the deal on any Cad Bane deck as well. And so that character in particular certainly felt the fallout of her balance of the force more than probably any other character. And to this day, he actually still doesn't have a really decent pairing or as powerful a pairing, nowhere even near, right? Lastly, another effect that is felt almost immediately when characters are rebalanced in this way is that there is in their card value in both or all of the following: playability, tradability, and monetary value, right, on the secondary market. Now, FFG doesn't care about the secondary market, mind you. Most developers and publishers aren't going to either, assuming that they're putting the game before anything else. The thing about card value is also that it's very subjective, right? Some people are willing to pay $50 for a Yoda right now, and some aren't. It's usually just that simple, right? What you're willing to pay versus what the average price something sells for realistically. But when a balance of the force happens, a card's value is recognized by the maker as having an objective value of some sort. And it is determined that that value is out of control in some kind of way. So just for fun, I want to discuss 2 scenarios to consider in card value. And the first is when a balance of the force impacts a meta-shaping card with a high value, the value on that card tanks significantly, right, in the secondary market. And number 2 is that a rule change or errata can impact the ability of a card or the playability of a card that previously had a high value, but now doesn't because of this rule or errata change. So in scenario 1, the balance of the force, impacting its value, that's Poe Dameron. Poe Damerons were going for pretty close to $50 before the fast hands errata, and slapping a balance of the force of 2 points on him essentially castrated his power level due to a lack now of proper pairings. You couldn't run him with 2 die anybody anymore, basically. And nowadays, you feel the effect of that in the long term because you can pick up a Poe Dameron for like under $5 now, right? For scenario 2, the rule or errata impacting playability, let's consider what would happen if the manner in which we resolve specials were suddenly to be modified in some way in the rules. Would Yoda still be a $50 card? I mean, when you look at a card like Force Speed, it has that 2 additional actions thing going for it, not to mention that it's a 0-cost upgrade with a die. So its value will always remain high because it does what another card in the game really just totally cannot do. The advantages are amazing. Yoda's value, on the other hand, would probably see a sudden plunge overnight in both playability and monetary card value. Now, with long-term advantages, we're trying to see the forest for the trees. Players can get stuck in a moment seeing only what is right before us, but the game is alive and always in flux as far as the developers are concerned. They're looking 6 months ahead at the next set or whatever, and they're trying to predict what's going to be strong and curb that in play testing, while also trying to fix the cards that are currently out that we have our hands on in the present, which they probably designed 6 months ago, right? So they're always working on this +6, -6 sort of thing, and that can be really tough, right? They weigh their pros and the cons to make all the following things happen to keep cards in check. And the first is opening design space. This is a concept that has been talked about to death on a lot of podcasts. I brought it up before. I know that some other guys who have talked about it as well. But this is a significant long-term effect that proper balance is going to have, and that is why it is used so often. A lot of talk around the more recent rules reference guides has been the changes that took place to cards like Heat of Battle and It's a Trap. And even for those players who loved red hero decks, they had to be aware that the reason certain heroes were so overcosted is because they were designed with other cards that already existed in the current format in mind. You can't deny, okay? I mean, I guess you could, but that would be really silly, okay? To think that Leia Organa in Awakenings and Base Malbus in SOR were assigned those point values because of the existence of these cards, okay? You really cannot deny that. Cards across the aisle in the villain side were not costed as high because they didn't have access to cards like It's a Trap in their repertoire. Thus, there was no need for them to have such a high point value, right? And I know there was a video where I put Leia and Phasma side by side, and that's literally the effect of something like It's a Trap or Heat of Battle existing in a format. And we call that kind of like opportunity cost, essentially, right? It's like paying an ATM fee up front before you get your money. Red heroes were going to be +2 points forever if that change did not happen. And the same could be said for the fast hands errata before, which, was already mentioned today. But in tandem with the cards that were taking advantage of fast hands, when this card was changed, those cards' power levels were reduced, and space to design other cards without the worry of how they would interact with fast hands was no longer a consideration across the board. So now FFG can design yellow characters with it in mind and sort blue, red, and gray heroes out however they decide to do it within their respective colors. Now, the second long-term effect of balance is the age-old resetting the power creep. And this will absolutely happen when stuff cycles out, but we can't always wait that long for a fix to a significant or perceived issue that is becoming a hindrance to players in the current meta, right? Like a character really dominating. Balance of the Force allows them to curb things back sort of mid-cycle to recreate a semblance or reality of balance again. Then some other more tolerable alternative usually rises to the top of the top decks in the place of the former monarch. One such king was FN2199, if you would think back to the SOR meta, and he needed very badly to be hit with some sort of nerf bat. And if he hadn't been, you'd be asking yourself this question: is FN2199 going to be the best character that the block will ever see? Is that it? No matter what comes next, it actually doesn't matter because nothing will ever be this strong? So in his case, he got not only a direct balance change to his points, but one of those scenarios we discussed earlier as well. An entire rule entry was modified to prevent abuse of his card ability on his and any potential characters going forward. And people are probably asking themselves right now, with the way that specials are designed and can be resolved, is Yoda going to go that way? It's starting to imagine that already in set 1 of this new blocks and only 4 or 5 sets deep, that they could be making similar quote-unquote mistakes. All right, I don't want you guys to yell at me in the comments for that. I'm doing that very sort of, carefully because I don't want to presume that I think it's a mistake. But if we're thinking about it a mistake, we're thinking they've kind of already corrected mistakes like this in terms of actual rule changes. So could it happen? Sure, it could absolutely happen. They could change how specials work overnight if they really wanted to. And we're going to talk more on this point later in the video, so I'm going to shelve that rest of that for the moment. Because I want to talk about the last long-term impact of balance, And it's enhancing variety of cards. And you might be thinking that this is exactly like opening design space, but it's not. It's actually quite different. Opening design space deals more with unshackling themselves from existing cards. Balance, in the manner that it enhances the variety of cards, can be looked at on a few different levels, whether from a rarity standpoint, which I actually don't think matters a whole lot in Destiny, or from just being able to play around with workable concepts and apply them in different ways. And I'm actually going to highlight 3 subcategories in this one for you in the next slide, okay? So let's go take a look at some examples of restrictive changes in balance insofar as they enhance the variety of cards. The 2 cards here, Isolation and Mislead, are 2 cards in the same category. They're both blue removal cards. One is villain only and the other is neutral, so it can be played in either deck. They both only remove a character die. One has a spot requirement and can remove a character die of any value. The other does not have a spot requirement, but is restricted to only removing die of value 2 or less, kind of like Electroshock. So most people would probably say Isolation is a better card since there are character dice with 3s on them. On the other hand, Mislead can hit most character die in the game, even with its restriction. The distinction between these is Mislead is trilogy legal and Isolation is not, right? Restrictive enhancements in this matter can help promote different styles of play across different formats and thus adding some form of balance across these different formats. And this particular subtle difference between these cards is a really good way to kind of highlight to you how they play around with things in terms of enhancing variety. So for the second example, we're going to take a look at a concept called riffing on an idea, which I'm sure you are all aware of just because of what you may have heard it applied in a different manner. So sometimes 2 base sets have cards that mirror each other in sort of space or concept, one hearkening back to the better card in some way. And here's 2 cards that I think are actually related in that exact way. It's Hyperspace Jump from Awakenings and Final Moment here in Legacies. Now, Hyperspace Jump is an amazing card that gives you insane control over the game, allowing you to forcibly end the action phase whenever you want for 3 resources, and in many of my mill matchups, the game itself. Now, Final Moment, on the other hand, gives you one last hurrah to try and win the day, and then the game is over. So Final Moment is sort of a different take or spin on Hyperspace Jump in a way that is far less pleasing. But as a personal note, I do think there's a deck out there for this card. That said, its potential to be a great card is there, you know. Now, hopefully, you can see that this concept of enhancing variety is actually quite different from just opening design space, right? Hyperspace Jump is never actually restricted the design space, but it doesn't do everything, and it still allows the designers to come up with cards that do stuff that is sort of like it, but not exactly the same, so that sets can have different cards, and these can exist side by side for a little while. Lastly, in the concept of enhancing variety is an application of a known concept in a different way. So this isn't exactly like riffing, but it's putting the same kind of ability in a different format of card. And if you've been playing since at least Empire, it's really no mystery that Quick Draw on the right here is basically Cad Bane's ability as an event. So when designing Cad's Bane ability, they had some idea that it would be very powerful with ambush weapons. And if that power level was satisfactory to them in testing and could be released and not be overpowered or require him to have a balance of the force change or an errata, then perhaps that ability could be shaped into other forms. And behold, Quick Draw is born. Now, there are considerations for making things cards, power actions, or even activated abilities, of course. And this one was considered to be okay to turn into a card, right? Because essentially, cards take up spots in your deck, which is probably why this is a 0 cost. And power actions are 1 use per round. And activated abilities are only happen when you roll out a character, which is usually just once per turn. So applying working things in different ways is a give and take, and it has to be properly weighed and measured to make sure its execution is actually worth the price of admission. Otherwise, players will deem something to be completely unplayable or just the opposite, overpowered. And quick draw is not one of those things that most people would think is overpowered, especially since now that it's a card, you actually only get to do it twice per game. Before we move on to talking about the Holocron documents, I want to cover, as quickly as I can, some of the considerations that play an important role in influencing the perception of whether balance is needed or not from a developer standpoint. And many of these are simple questions, and here they are. And the first one is this card undercosted or overcosted in standard, which is the baseline format? And if it's undercosted or overpowered, what other cards similar to it are less powerful for equal or more points? And then, why? Are there cards enabling this card better or worse than others because of color, faction, interaction of its ability with other characters' abilities, or other supports or upgrades? And this is a complex inquiry, right? You could spend a while just trying to hammer things out when you create a new card and saying, okay, how does this work with what's already in existence, right? And you could literally create something that's overcosted or overcosted, right? And remember that under or overcosted actually can mean more than just characters. Perhaps an event is too cheap or too costly at its power level too. Though they kind of seem more apt to changing card text rather than resource cost on cards, unless you're Tinker. Sorry, Tinker. You got misprinted pretty hard. The next considerations are proactive approaches, and this is a big umbrella term, right? But essentially this means seeing the problem before it becomes a problem and fixing it. And one of the strangest proactive balance changes we ever got came in the form of an errata to the Outer Rim Smuggler right before SOR actually was released, or right at the second that it was released. FFG recognized that with a very small set of cards, you could create a combo wherein you generated an infinite number of resources in a very silly way. So they put a stop to that, and the errata was live before we even had the card in our hands with incorrect text on it. On the flip side, on the other end of the spectrum, we have reactive approaches, which are generally considered the most common sorts of balance changes. Players break things in the game, and FFG feels compelled to fix it because they didn't see it in playtesting. How compelled they are to fix it is the question, however, right? So with Fast Hands, they felt fairly compelled, okay? Poe Dameron, not so much. FF2199, somewhere in the middle. One significant factor to it is this concept of the worldwide meta, usually defined by what is winning tournaments all over the place, and if how it's winning is in the spirit of the actual game of Destiny. And it's not a terribly bad measuring stick to think of it that way, but when major tournaments aren't taking place, like after Store Championship season before Nationals happen, you need to listen a little harder to what's going on at the local level. And local levels are generally a lot quieter than those big tournaments, so you may not find those things right away. And so this is where interaction with the general population of the game is really, really super critical and important to ensuring that balance is balanced at all times. And those are pretty much the considerations that I came up with or that I felt were worth presenting. Again, proactive and reactive are these big, big umbrella terms. You could probably dissect those much, much smaller if you really wanted to. But again, those are the ones I felt that were worth presenting. There's probably some other ones. And if you want to highlight those, please feel free to put them down in the comments. So now that things are rolling and draft is coming into play, FFG is now putting out their Holocron documents. And these PDFs are supposed to include format-specific rules that are worth highlighting alongside listings of the sets that are legal within that particular format that the Holocron document refers to. And I'm going to start by saying that this is a superb idea. If you haven't already checked these things out, you should do that right after this video because they're going to act as a perfect quick reference guide for all things moving forward in all the formats, right? But a comment on these things that really makes them shine to me is that they actually include the erratas and the balance of the force changes that are applicable to the format that Holocron is about. And a year from now, when the Infinite format gets its Holocron document officially, it's going to allow them to modify how those particular modifications to the game rules impact that format. So you might see Captain Phasma or FN2199 or Poe go back to their old point cost. Additionally, it would be odd, but not disallowed, for newer heroes to get an increase in points just for that format. I mean, I think that's unlikely, of course, but it depends on if they want to maintain a true balance in Infinite or if they want it to be this just completely untamed territory. And I'm really looking forward to it myself, but for now, we've got these great 2 Holocron documents that are doing their job pretty dang well. So thanks to FFG for that. And finally, before we get out of here, let's talk about the current state of affairs, at least as far as I have heard it through the grapevine. When it comes to balance, everyone's got an opinion, right? There's always talk at the store about what if this character was 1 point less, or this character needs to be 2 points more. People talk all the time, and it's innocent. It can be fun to engage in that sort of conversation too. I've certainly heard a lot of that, and I've read a lot of that stuff too. But what's the word on the street? Okay, well, we are smack in the middle of a regional season, and so people are going to be quite charged about certain things. But the most common opinions that I've heard regarding balance of the force changes is that Isla needs one basically like yesterday. And I get it. For 12 points, she is really, really good. She's got a pretty good die, decent or better than decent, and one of those specials that lets you special chain with red and blue cards. So she fits into a lot of decks also because of her point cost, which is like dirt cheap, right? It doesn't get much cheaper for unique characters than 912. You know, we've seen a 710 on villain and hero, and we've seen a couple 811s, but 912 is great, right? She's basically this set's Ray in terms of filling a role at that point cost. And Ray is still good, mind you, but Isla is a workhorse with a different skill set. And she has probably gone farther sooner than Ray did at the time of Awakenings, right? Now, another character that everyone's been talking about is, of course, and I'm going to give you a second to think about it. Yeah, it's Yoda. And it's because he has topped or been part of decks, a lot of top decks in regionals. He's either winning them, coming in second, top 4, top 8. He's definitely hitting top 16. He hit the scene very hard, and it's justified because he is a damn good character, right? He's 10-13, so he's got Kanan's point value, but he doesn't do any damage. In fact, 3 of his sides are about changing your other dice to sides that you want. So essentially, he's a support character, right? But then there's all those blue weapons that pack specials on their die, and suddenly Yoda seems like he could be a finisher, right? And he hasn't shined in that particular role, but can he do it? Absolutely, yes, he can do it. But he's not the best at it. But all these considerations don't stop people from clamoring for an increase of about 1 point at the very least, which maybe sounds okay to me, but it won't change the special chaining mechanic, okay? You can do that with him at any point cost, right? Whether he was 12, 15, 11, 14, you can still do that, right? Perhaps, though, these guys will get a balance of the force change. I don't know for sure. I mean, and everyone's got a different opinion on it. But the thing that I do want to mention is my feelings on something, because I've been asked this more than a handful of times, and even just this past weekend at regionals, I had a lot of people coming up to me, and let me tell you, that's awesome. Okay, people being like, "I watch your stuff, cool, whatever." I love that stuff. That's fine. But people ask me this question a lot, okay? And the thing is, I think people are too quick to want balance of the force changes now that we know it's a thing in Destiny. And instead, I think people need to look fundamentally at how the rules work and also how the interactions between cards come to be. And I, for one, do in fact feel, and this is the thing I got asked a lot about, that special chaining is pure bullshit. It is not what I would call in the spirit of Destiny. I'm supposed to do an action, then you do an action. And I always thought that an action was about resolving maybe one or two dice, or re-rolling, or activating, or some small bite-sized little action that you could do, okay? So the small steps that illustrated some great big grand plan that played out over the course of, the turn, the round, the game in general. But there is no grand plan when rolling one special means resolving 6 dice and then claiming next round so that I can play my game of solitaire. Quite frankly, I find that very distasteful, and it's not something that I want to play with, and it's certainly not something I want to play against. So I didn't take it to regionals because I thought it was crap. Now, I recognize that mistakes get made in the writing of the rules. Again, I'm not implying that they made a mistake with the whole, special chaining thing. What I want to talk about instead is that the overriding rule was considered a pretty big mistake by FFG standards, it seems, so they changed it. And was that all FF2199's fault? I don't know. Can we place the blame all on a single character? I feel like perhaps Awakening's Ray shouldered some of that blame too. Maybe, but it also restricted how they could design cards in the future, right? And so perhaps Ayla, Poe, Yoda, and all the offenders to the rules on how we resolve are actually considered right now at FFG offenders to the rule on how we resolve special size of the die. I don't know. I kind of feel like they went overboard with the whole special chain thing, But I feel too like we have enough perpetrators now to prove that the mechanic is outright unpalatable for some players to be dealing with. So we'll see what happens, right, in the coming months, hopefully. So if you ask me how I feel about this recently, I actually didn't say all this stuff about how I felt about it. You probably heard some answer that was very abridged, like a too long didn't read version, which was like, oh, that crap needs to stop because it's bad for the game. That's pretty much what I've been telling people. And I still think it is. I really do. Well, Rebels, that's just about all I had to say on the matter of balance for tonight. And I hope it doesn't seem weird coming off a video where some people have felt that I was like harshly criticizing FFG. I really wasn't. And this one should have a somewhat different tone, okay? I was going for logical justification and support of their process, which I feel I might have right in some ways, barring some internal things that I really don't know about, and we'll never know at the end of the day. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this lengthy video on this subject, and even if it's not even close to the reality of what's going on in the studio, I bet it still gave you something to think about, right? If so, I've done my job. Y'all waited a week for this one, and I'm getting it out to you on a really late on Friday night, and so I hope it was worth the wait. You can tell me about that in the comments, or if you like my stuff, subscribe, donate to the Patreon, follow me on Facebook, all that good stuff. I also have a Twitter. You can see all that stuff down in the show notes. That said, I don't actually have anything in the pipe right now because, but it is worth mentioning, I guess, that you can catch me on the Golden Dice podcast, which I was on last night and was actually released this morning. Usually they release it a little bit later, but they got it out real quick. And there are a bunch of good guys from the South Jersey, Pennsylvania meta, I believe. So if you don't subscribe to them, go check that out. You can find them here on YouTube. They're on iTunes, Google Play Store, I believe, and they have a Facebook page as well. So Golden Dice Podcast. I actually got to meet one of their co-hosts, Tommy, very briefly at the New Jersey Boonton Regional this past Saturday. And we talk about all that stuff on the episode. That's why I didn't do my own personal episode on it. Check it out because it was a pretty good episode, I think. Alrighty, folks, until next time, whenever that is, remember to play the deck that you love, not the one that you think should win. Never forget that it's just a game, and may the Force be with you.